In this video I'm going to take a look at a claim that is sometimes made that says the sound of an instrument is identifiable to the human ear because of the very initial onset or attack of that sound. There's something there, maybe a transient, that identifies to the ear what we're listening to. And to start out with, I've pulled up a piano sample, and we're looking at the audio signal of a C5 key being hit on a keyboard. Let's listen to it. That's fairly recognizable as a piano sound. What we see is that the sound begins with a transient, a spike in amplitude that's of very short duration. Then there's a decay stage and a sustain stage, and they've looped the sustain so that it could sustain indefinitely if we held down the key indefinitely on the keyboard, which isn't necessarily what a real piano would do, but the point is that they did not sample the release and instead have left that to the synthesizer to generate the release envelope. But I don't notice it doesn't bother my ear that I don't hear that release when I suddenly stop the sample, because in this case the sustain is already such a low amplitude. But what happens if we cut off that initial transient? The sound begins to get a little bit uncanny. Certainly if we were to cut off that entire part, it's at that point not recognizable. Well, what if we fade instead? And that also has the effect of making the sound unrecognizable as a piano. Okay, let's look at another instrument. Here's a violin. The violin's audio signal is quite a bit different. The first thing I notice is that there is no transient at the onset of the sound. In other words, there's no brief peak, prominent peak in amplitude. And this sound has a gradual attack, and then it comes into the sustain phase. And let's listen. Now the strangest thing to my ear actually is that I miss the release. So if I stop playing the sample right in the middle of the sustain loop, then all of a sudden there's silence, and that's what seems strange. But if I move the start of the sound over, sounds maybe a little bit messy. I want to hear more of a smooth transition. If I fade it in, that doesn't really change the profile of the sound very much. And that with the fade in, I think it's still quite recognizable as a violin sound. Now if I play that violin sample on the keyboard, here you can see this area of the screen where I'm looking at these sliders. This is an envelope generator in the synthesizer that plays that violin sample. And if I call that up down here on this violin track and play it on the keyboard, I've got a little bit of a release that's been programmed in, and that makes it sound a lot more natural. Here we're looking at the audio signal of a violin that I recorded, and you can see that much like the sampled violin sound, that's a recording of just a single note, the onset of each note in this audio signal is very gradual. There's no transient to be found at the beginning. And we also notice as we go along that the envelopes that are generated by the bow as it plays the violin, they're very random, it seems. Look at this. It's all over the place. So let's listen to this scale. just want to stop right there. There was a transient that you heard. It was a bump as the violinist hit the bow on the wall while she was playing. Let's listen to that. That transient isn't part of the violin sound. And you'll notice that the amplitudes are all over the place on this, but it's recognizable as a violin. Another common way to modulate amplitude is with the use of a compressor. And compressors have been used forever in recording because in the early days we didn't have enough, bandwidth to express the dynamic range of instruments in radio signals or on a vinyl recording, and so they would compress the signal to bring down those peaks and to kind of make uniform that envelope of the sound. And that's a lot of what accounts for kind of that muffled old sound of a piano. And so what I've done is I've added a compressor to this piano track where I'm playing the scale on the sample piano. So let's listen to, first of all, the piano sound without the compressor enabled. Okay, so that's a fairly straightforward sound. Now if I turn on the compressor and play it, it seems to make a difference. It's not quite the right sound. Let's look at the compressed versus uncompressed audio signal. So here is the uncompressed signal, and you can see it's got a lot of peaks in it, some transients in there. And the compressed version is very much more uniform. And the same goes for the piano, the violin. So if you recall, here's the violin audio signal, and then I recorded a compressed version of it, and it made a stereo signal, but this is that same signal, and it's very much a uniform signal. What does it sound like with the violin? Alright, let's listen to the violin, the compressed violin. The interesting thing to me is that the compression seems to be more effective on the piano, at least audibly effective. And the sound that I get from a compressed piano is less recognizable to my ear than the compressed violin sound. So the envelope that is generated by the bow on the strings is maybe not so critical to the human hearing as other parts of the sound. So the one thing I've learned is that it's a complex thing, how we identify sounds. Sometimes I guess if you take off that initial transient, if there is one, and change the very beginning part of the sound, then it's going to be important enough to that sound that it changes the entire nature of it and makes it unrecognizable. In other instances, maybe not so much.